but I think has a lot of relevance for us now. In 2018, I was on the King trip to Italy, and I went to a town called Assisi, and I got this. It's a little T-shaped cross, because I, like many, many other people, was going as a pilgrim to the town of Assisi to remember St Francis of Assisi. It's a name you may have heard. He's a figure of remarkable historical impact and importance. He's also somebody whom we regard as a saint. Now, you may or may not have come from a church tradition that recognizes saints. If not, this is somebody that we look to as an exemplar, but also a companion, somebody who teaches us about life and about God, even 800 years after his death. St. Francis is somebody that appealed to Jon Sweeney as a teenager. He became interested in the saint and began to pursue more and more knowledge of him, and over the course of his career, he's published about 40 books, and about 15 of them are about St. Francis of Assisi, along with other people. So it's been a lifelong relationship for him, and therefore his embedded wisdom from the saint is particularly well shaped and honed. So John's going to tell us about this 800 and plus year old saint and his impact on us today. He's also going to be available after this. We'll go to the library for coffee and some snacks if you want to come and talk to him about saints, or about the state of Vermont where he lives, or about Milwaukee where he used to live, or about the publishing industry. That's a good chance to do so. Following coffee, we'll go to lunch, and we'll be in the Tipton room at about 11:30. Tonight, John will be speaking at Central Presbyterian Church at 7 p.m., and we'll have a little reception at the end of that, as well as a book signing. Thank you for being here this morning. Thank you for joining us in spite of our us kind of snow, and please join me in welcoming Jon Sweeney.
Good morning, everyone. You're awake. Thanks for being here. I know the weather was a little dicey, but you should know that where I come from in northern New England, we call this the promise of spring. So, one of my old teachers used to say that we each drag a long, invisible bag around behind us. And I want you to picture this for yourself. But first, you have to see yourself as a young child, full of energy and joy and creativity and enthusiasm. You were living in the present moment. You were fully aware of what was happening right now, without a care in the world for what might take place tomorrow. That was you at the age of 2. You were really cute, I'll bet. But then your parents perhaps got a little tired of your enthusiasm and your energy. I've been a parent 4 times over, and we all do this. They said, "Be still and quiet down." Maybe they became very upset when you knocked something over. They called you careless. In my house, I remember it was when I knocked over a glass of milk at the kitchen table, and my parents totally freaked out. So we put the parts of us that our parents didn't like so much into that bag. Next, we go to school, and then our teachers get into the act. Stop talking, they say. Sit up straight. Don't wiggle. Or in the case of my son Joe, they tell him, if you ever fall down in the grass when you're playing at recess outside, then the game is over. They didn't want complaints from parents at the end of the day when the kids came home with grass stains on their blue jeans. So we put the parts of us that our teachers don't like so much into the invisible bag too. And we drag that bag behind us. Then it really gets complicated because we go to high school. There, people our own age put great pressure on us to be a certain way, to look a certain way, and all of that pressure essentially creates self-obsessed neurotics of all of us. I was paranoid about every little blemish on my face. I remember it well. I remember running to the bathroom between classes to check it out to see how I was doing. And I remember I always wanted more hair on my body. like some of the basketball players had, because the girls seemed to be really interested in their legs. So I put the parts of myself that I was taught to dislike into my bag. And I quietly carried that bag everywhere I went. Some people are still carrying their bags behind them wherever they go. Francis Bernardone, that's the name that Francis of Assisi had before he became a saint, had quite a heavy bag that he carried around until he discovered the freedom and the joy that came in leaving that bag behind. Now, like Francis's 13th century, we live in a precarious time. The world is again caught up in fascism and abuses of power. Appeals to justice and the common good seem unable to provide a sufficient check or balance. I see idealism often being rapidly abandoned. Even people of the same faith seem never to be able to talk about it with each other if they're on opposite sides of issues. We're occasionally reminded by well-meaning people to keep hope alive. I heard Dr. King's biographer, Jonathan Egg, do so at a recent book festival in Kentucky. And it leads us to ask some unavoidable questions. Are appeals to God in this moment naive? Are they escapist? I'm interested in St. Francis's experiences of God because I believe that they offer hope for all of us to experience something similar. But in moments like this, does that mean that I am or we are trying to escape the world? I really don't think so. I think instead that experiencing God is about living authentically to who we are meant to be, kind of like that kid before he started dragging that invisible bag around. This was all true for Francis Bernardone, the birth name of St. Francis of Assisi, until it wasn't. And then he began teaching everyone who would listen that we are in fact slaves to what others have told us is important, to the money and success and the power and persona that we have created. But if you listen and if you watch his example, I think he shows us a way to save our lives. I've been passionate about Francis and his life and his teachings and the way that he imitated Christ in ways that most of us regard as idealistic or we toss off as mere metaphor. I've been interested in him for a long time now, since I was your age. I saw in his life a discovery of what was important and a tossing away of what really didn't matter. You have to consider for a moment who Francis was. He was from a wealthy family. His father was a merchant. Francis traveled throughout Europe with his dad, most likely, selling these fancy silks and colored fabrics that his dad was a merchant of throughout the region. Francis learned to speak French. The reason he's named Francis is because his father was out of town when he was born. His mother named him Giovanni, John, but his father came home and said, no, he needs to be named Francesco, Francis. He was the kid who always had money in his pocket. He was the kid who always got invited to parties. He was a lot of fun. He was a bit frivolous. He was the kind of kid who would rush to the mirror to check out how his blemishes were looking between classes. But there came a time when he started to experience failure. He started to understand vulnerability. It happened when he was trying to live up to what his father wanted for him. Francis had a complicated relationship with his dad, one that was never really reconciled. Every year when Father's Day comes around, I make a point of mentioning to some friends and others that Francis is the world's most famous saint. That is true, but he had an unreconciled relationship with his father for the rest of his life, and that's unusual. So Francis went from being a very normal teenager, from a family of certain privilege, to becoming someone who embraced lepers to becoming someone who wanted to share the gospel, who wanted to live the gospel in the way that Jesus talked about it in very specific ways. It was 1226, exactly 800 years ago, when he died in the Umbrian hill town that his name made famous. And you could say, why turn back to a moment 8 centuries ago in the past to look for experiences of God? But I think the answer is, I'd like to look back to Francis in part because I find him respected by people of all backgrounds, of all religious backgrounds, and by people who also want nothing to do with religion. He's not just a Catholic saint, he seems to be everyone's saint. I have none, as in no official religion affiliation, and done, as in officially done with religion, friends who love Francis of Assisi. I have evangelical friends who look to Francis, even though they were raised in a tradition that tells them that the whole idea of saints is misguided. I was such a person, by the way, raised in the evangelical church who then fell in love with saints, even though I wasn't supposed to, particularly St. Francis. In my case, it led to eventually becoming a Roman Catholic, but it can go a lot of ways for a lot of different people. I also have Jewish friends, Muslim friends, and Buddhist friends who claim Francis as their own. So many times someone has said, "He's my favorite saint," and I have responded, "Really?" So I like Francis because his life and spiritual practice seem to speak to people across boundaries. There's no question that Francis felt God's presence in some very powerful and specific ways. Some of them were embodied, and some have a more internal expression of faith that is intensely personal. Others are involved with justice, and others are passionate expressions of belief that Francis tells us he knew he was in divine company when they were taking place. Let me offer a few as examples for you. The first one is about how he set about freeing captive creatures. In one of his most iconic gestures, Francis set creatures free, feeling God's joy in doing so. Most people wouldn't think of doing this. We tend rather to like holding things really close. For example, I live lovingly with a dog and 2 cats, and I feed the birds from my porch most of the year, knowing full well that to do so really is something for me more than it is for them. I like to imagine that I'm helping them through the winter, but I know that scientists tell me I'm probably not. But I do it because I like to keep them close. I want to observe them. I want to feel near them. When Francis was drawn to animals, birds, and creatures, which he was all of his life, he was also uncomfortable with catching them, holding them, or keeping them in cages. He seems to have understood their need and their desire to be free, and he seems to have understood their instinct to spread their wings or legs and go. A worm's bristles help it to move through the soil, and in this way, a worm does what it's meant to do. The hind legs of a rabbit are so strong that a rabbit can go from standstill to full scamper in half a second. A fish's tail moves it through the water really quickly, and its other fins steer where the fish needs to go. When a fish does this and swims freely in a moving stream, it's an example of the original beauty of the creature. I wonder how Francis must have pondered the wildness, the instinctual creator lovingness of human beings who also want to be free, when he was insisting on setting loose non-human creatures who had been caught. Books, in fact, could be written about all the human institutions that St. Francis of Assisi himself steered clear of, so intent was he on being free like a bird. This came while he was also learning to let go of that bag dragging behind him. There was the time when a fisherman took Francis out in his boat, and when he reeled in the best catch of the day, he handed it to the friar, grateful to be able to provide for him and to thank him for what he's done. And Francis receives the fish in his 2 hands, and he blesses it, and he tosses it back into the water, watching the fish swim away. He wasn't always silent when he did these things. With birds, who he seemed to often be setting free, Francis always appeared to want to communicate with them, saying things like, "Sisters, don't let yourself be captured in the first place. Fly free as you were meant to do. Sing and praise your Creator now because it makes God happy." In some religions, angels might be disguised as birds. How many a child seen a hummingbird for the first time has believed this? In one beautiful Islamic legend, birds are even seen speaking the words of God. And in a certain Tibetan Buddhist legend, a cuckoo preaches Dharma to fellow avians. Francis would stop by the outdoor market in Assisi, where boys and girls and other working people were selling doves. You have to picture a warm weekday morning and vendors all around, their wares displayed in carts that they wheeled to that place. In Umbria, in the year 1206 or 1207, doves were used for dinner and also as egg layers. They sat noisily in their cages that morning, cooing, talking with each other in the open air. To readers of the Bible, a dove sometimes symbolizes God's Spirit, because the Gospel of Matthew says that when Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River, God, in the guise of a dove, alighted on Jesus' shoulders at precisely that moment. This is why in fine art, you'll often see a dove in a painting, symbolizing the creative spirit of God hovering over a special scene, as if to breathe life into things or inspire fresh perspectives. On this occasion, Francis convinced a boy with cages of beautiful white and black and brown doves to give 2 to him. He then turned to one side and, throwing his arms up in the air, he let them fly. There's also an anecdote of Francis saving a rabbit from a similar fate. It was caught by someone in a trap, but the saint took it and carried it to the woods, where he set it down in the grass, watching it go. His curiosity was fired by his gentleness, and then he wanted everyone to be free. I can only imagine how onlookers must have thought Francis was out of his mind. Who does this kind of thing, anyway? Here's that Bernardone kid again. He really has gone mad, they must have said. But a countercultural sort of foolishness was part of Francis's makeup, and part of why his spiritual movement caught fire soon after he was doing these things. I feel I can sort of see Francis's imagination in those moments, flying with those birds, free of constraints, or scampering with that rabbit into the undercover, leaving behind the worldly expectations of his earthly father and all the condemnations of people who knew him before his conversion and made fun of him, soaring into the sky or running fast with pleasure and joy. Now, I'm no theologian, but one might say that salvation means exactly this sort of holy, wind-swept freedom, or that salvation should be like this. In fact, the Spanish liberation theologian Jon Sweeney once said, "In Jesus' eyes, God's ultimate historical word is love, whereas the ultimate historical word of power in the human world is oppression." Francis did the same thing with sheep and lambs, often begging those who were about to prepare them for a meal to let him instead set them back on their feet. However, there was one instance when a lamb was gifted to Francis and he was comfortable keeping it. Monks and friars were usually not supposed to keep pets, because care for a pet in a monastery or a friary or in any living in community situation can become a point of division, and that's to be avoided as much as possible. This is still true in most places. Also, it usually costs money to care for an animal, and Francis's vow was to poverty. But most of all, he loved to see animals roaming free. So Francis tried to set this lamb free, but the lamb had already grown attached to him and followed closely at his heels around the friary. It was often heard bleating as it trailed Francis around the little chapel below Assisi called Porciuncula. Finally, the friar entrusted this lamb with a friend named Jacoba, and she cared for it in the ways that a shepherd would. She also wove some of its wool with which she lined Francis's simple, light habit one winter when he was sick and needed to avoid the cold. There were other shepherds who remembered Francis speaking to their flocks as they were grazing and he was walking by, and the sheep responding to him almost as if a good friend. The creatures focused on him and gave him such a loud bleating that the shepherds were shocked at how they frisked about him so extraordinarily, one account says. It wasn't simply that doves and lambs symbolized God to Francis. He was often remembering in his sermons how Christ was compared to a lamb. One couldn't say the same, surely, about things like worms and fish. Loving the captive creature and helping to literally set it free is what this expression of Francis was about. And it was that freedom in the air or water or grass that meant feeling God's presence. I think Francis felt this freedom himself in how he himself had been set free by God, and in how following Jesus the shepherd allowed him to also live without joy and without worry. And my point, I guess, is this: the experience of caring for and freeing captive creatures was a way of experiencing the joy and pleasure of God who wants to set all captives free. Francis went about this work wherever he was. I've been mostly talking about his doing so with non-human creatures, but of course there are stories of Francis doing similar things with people, helping to set them free. And this is all replicable. Each of us could find ways to help set captives free. Now let me turn to a second experience of God, focusing on how Francis experienced God by learning tenderness. It is immediately upon returning to Assisi, having failed as a crusader and a knight, which are things that he did to try to please his father, and he failed at miserably, that Francis, for the first time, seems to have a profound experience of God. Chronologically, this experience really comes at the head of the line before setting captives free, or just about any other experience of God he tells us that he had. And it comes to him as what we call grace, a divine gift that is totally unexpected, certainly unearned, in ways that surprise the young man, not to mention all of his former friends. Unable even to move, or the text says to speak, we learn that he was suddenly filled with tenderness. Standing nearby were all of his old friends, hangers-on mostly, who valued the frivolous and shallow Francis they'd known as teenagers, the now strange guy who had once paid for things and was always fun at a party. They couldn't conceive what was happening because, unlike their friend, they hadn't yet met God in order to find themselves. In a homily that he once preached, Oscar Romero, the Archbishop of San Salvador, who was assassinated in 1980 for standing up for the poor and the oppressed, said, "People do not know themselves unless they have encountered God. That is why there are so many me worshipers, so many arrogant people, so many self-centered worshipers of false gods." Those old friends saw Francis undergo a sensitivity to God's presence, and it made no sense to them at all. "What are you thinking about, a woman?" one of them joked to him one day, to which Francis naively or dreamily, or both, not really knowing where it was headed, responded by saying, Yes, I was thinking of a woman more beautiful than any of us has ever known. His angry father becomes even angrier at the insult of his son turning tender, when what he wanted him was to be tough and strong and worldly powerful. So Francis's father actually gathered a posse to search for the young man, to straighten him out. And when Francis heard of it, most likely his mother warned him, he goes into hiding for a full month. Even when he emerges from hiding and makes his way back onto the streets of Assisi again, his old friends and previous neighbors threw mud and stones at him, the text says. No one wanted to allow a transformation of gentleness and tenderness to take place in the guy that they used to like so much. And then soon, other strange changes take place. Francis begins to walk more slowly, careful of what he steps on. How to walk reverently over rocks, he ends up teaching his friends how to do. How crazy this must have seemed to people then. Have you ever known a Christian who teaches such things? What seminary, then or now, can a pastor learn to reverently walk over rocks? Let me offer you another example, a more recent example, and from another somewhat famous Christian that I admire. You might have heard of the Catholic monk Thomas Merton, who died in 1968 and spent most of his life at the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky. Thomas Merton wrote a famous autobiography called The Seven-Story Mountain that I urge all of you to read if you haven't. He wrote a bunch of other books too, but that's the story of his own conversion from a life kind of like the life that Francis had as a young man to a life devoted to God and to meaning. Merton was a spiritual seeker, but he was also a rather philosophical, heady kind of a guy. And there was a famous Vietnamese Buddhist monk named Thich Nhat Hanh, who I imagine a few of you have heard of, who came to visit Merton in the early 60s at the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky. Thich Nhat Hanh was younger than Merton, and he was a fairly young monk at the time. And Merton was so excited to have this interfaith conversation with a Buddhist monk. So we know that one of the first questions that Merton asked Thich Nhat Hanh when he came to visit him at the monastery was, "What did you learn your first year in the monastery in Vietnam?" And the Buddhist monk responded, "I learned how to open and close doors quietly." Merton was thrown by this. He was expecting a philosophical discussion, some kind of an interesting Catholic-Buddhist dialogue starting point. But instead, that's what Thich Nhat Hanh said he had learned in his first year, how to open and close doors quietly. It's that kind of gentleness and tenderness that I'm talking about that Francis of Assisi was learning. So Francis's friends turned away from him even more when this stuff was happening. People prefer the familiar, and when someone close to them changes so completely, we can't help but feel it as a kind of criticism. We think, was something wrong with how we used to be together? Then come the stories of Francis talking with birds and freeing the rabbits and the fish from capture. These accounts are all filled with references to tenderness and also sweetness, not simply as something that he felt as an emotion or spoken to others, because he didn't really talk about it, but as a way that he was becoming in the world around him. The accounts of what happened then, which were written by less than sensitive people, even say that the irrational creatures recognized his feeling of tenderness toward them. This was a breakthrough that was incomprehensible to others, and an encounter of God that, although he couldn't yet grasp it, Francis was willing to experience and let it lead him. What a fool he was. Power and influence, even simple life and liberty, were created by nothing to do with tenderness. Francis's was the era when knights carrying banners of the cross marched across Europe and used their weaponry to dominate and subdue Muslims and Jews and infidels and even Christians that they thought were of the wrong sort. Power was the most valued of possessions. There was little understanding of strength in peace, let alone tenderness. Power and domination were how things were done, and these were the ways of men. Even the Pope at the time was not so much a spiritual leader as a political and military one, with armies of his own. And across the Silk Road from Europe was Genghis Khan at the same time, conquering China and Central Asia with similar forms of brutality. His armies killed millions of people, and he too was known as great. When Francis went to see the Sultan in 1219, which is another episode that I won't really get to, it's a story that maybe you've heard before. Genghis Khan was not far away, just across the Euphrates River in the midst of conquering Baghdad. And any sort of tenderness among leaders in churches or anywhere else was deeply countercultural. It still is. But this is also probably why the Franciscan movement grew so dramatically, because people sensed that there was something different about it and about Francis. You should know that there were a lot of people in Francis's time that were saying and doing similar church reforming kinds of things. And yet Francis's movement was by far the most popular of them all. Why was that? I've often wondered. And I think it's because people can tell what's real, and Francis was real. The ways of power really haven't changed that much. Only the technology to implement and exert that power has changed and improved. And this is why the letter that Thich Nhat Hanh, you remember the Buddhist monk I told you about from the 1960s, the letter that he wrote to then U.S. President George Bush in August of 2006 is so simple, poignant, and frankly, Franciscan. It was more than 20 years ago that I wrote a little book called the St Francis Prayer Book, in which I suggested in the introduction that Gandhi wasn't a Christian, but he was a follower of Christ in a very real way. Some people didn't like me saying that, but now, yes, I am also saying that a Buddhist monk can offer an example of a Christ-like Franciscan spirit. The U.S. war in Iraq was ongoing at the time when Thich Nhat Hanh wrote the letter to President Bush in 2006. He told the president about a dream he had had the night before and how upon waking, and now I'm quoting, "I thought of the situation in the Middle East, and for the first time, I was able to cry." He went on saying, "I cried for a long time and I felt much better after about 1 hour. Then I went to the kitchen and made some tea." What a fool. Without a doubt, whoever in the White House read that letter thought, what a fool. But how very relevant that teaching was and still is. Thich Nhat Hanh said that day, and I'm quoting again, "Mr. President, I think that if you could allow yourself to cry like I did this morning, you would also feel much better. It is our brothers that we kill over there. They are our brothers. God tells us so, and we also know it. With some awakening, we can see things in a different way, and this will allow us to respond differently to the situation." So, I guess what I'm saying is, I think we need awakings of tenderness, and we can look to St. Francis for ideas. And now, in closing, let me turn to one final aspect of Francis that I believe is relevant for us where we are today. It is the way in which he continued to pray all his life with a questioning, questing spirit. Even in his own lifetime, in the last few years of his life, Francis had gained such a reputation as a saint that people were starting to do things like wanting to touch his garment so they could say that they were near him. It was kind of the 13th century version of an Ussie. But you never see Francis being conscious of any of this kind of thing. You very rarely seen him even getting up to speak. But one thing that we do see all the way to the end is that there is a certain way that he prayed. And he prayed with two questions. He would go out into the woods often, or he would go to a cave. He would go out at night so he couldn't be seen. And by the way, the reason why we know these stories that I'm telling you about is because there were friars, fellow religious brothers, who would follow him quietly, and then they wrote down what happened. And he would go out by himself and he would say to God, he would say, "Who are you, God, and who am I?" Those two questions. Who are you, God, and who am I? Now think about that first question for a moment. This is, for those of us who keep track of such things, the greatest saint that the church has ever seen. And to the end of his life, he's asking, "Who are you, God?" You know, the great saint is supposed to be also the great theologian, right? You're supposed to know exactly who God is, and I could tell you in a 10-point plan. But that's not what it was for Francis. God was alive. God was not something just in a creed, but God was living. And Francis's relationship with God was ever changing. So, who are you, God, was the first question. And then, just as important and just reliant upon the first question was the second one. And who am I? Again, you would think Francis would know who he was as an adult. We're all supposed to know who we are. Certainly as a great saint, he knew who he was. He could have told you very succinctly and clearly, like we might do in a job interview. But it was a living, ongoing relationship that he was having. His conversion was lifelong, and he was constantly trying to figure out, who am I? He had let go of that bag that he had been pulling around behind him. But he never let go of the need to ask questions, to pray, to be alone with God, and to seek the answers that were always open questions between him and his Creator. So I would encourage you to find ways of tenderness. I would encourage you to set captives free. And I would encourage you to ask those two questions. Who are you, God, and who am I? Preferably when others are not around. And I guess let me leave it right there, and let me wish for all of you experiences of God, perhaps even of freedom and joy, a kind of salvation, increases in tenderness, and a spirit of asking questions, always asking questions. Thank you very much.
For that wonderful reflection on St. Francis. And I wanted to let you all know of an additional opportunity later this week. If you're interested in St. Francis, if you want to talk more about who you are and who God is, or learn more about this in a small group setting, we're going to start something that we're calling Follow-Up Fridays. And we'll have a little bit of breakfast, a little bit of discussion. And for students, you can get a CC credit, but you have to sign up for it in advance. So there should be up behind me, a QR code. If you want to sign up for this coming Friday, 9:15, on the second floor of the library, you can get a CC credit, breakfast, good conversation. So please come out and join us. Also remember, right after this, Dr. Sweeney will be in the library if you'd like to talk to him further. And he will also be at Central Presbyterian Church tonight at 7 p.m. So thank you, Dr. Sweeney, and thank you all, and have a great day.